Thank you very much, Joe. This is a talk where I've been trying to figure out how to think about a form of drawing that's rather different from what people have been talking about so far in some way. And all the drawings that I show you are probably from about 62 to 64, all by Eva Hesse. There's going to be a drawing show of her work at Oberlin, which holds a vast amount of Hesse's work, especially her drawings. But anyhow, so trying to figure something out about these drawings. So drawing, at least so everyone says, came easily to Eva Hesse. As her first major writer, Lucy Lippard, put it early on, she could always draw, even when she was having trouble with painting, and the drawings expressed her deepest feelings. This narrative of drawing is somehow her most authentic medium, the one to which she was most committed and would return to throughout, has held, as if drawing is this continuous thread through the work. As she turned from the painter she began as to the sculptor she became. So her facility with drawing was admired. It was envied by her artist friends, and there was certainly, a kind of ferocious sense of herself and her hand on a sheet of paper, however diverse and varied her drawing practice would become. So drawing was a habit that Hesse developed. She hadn't always had it. She learnt to draw. She was one of those people who learnt to draw. She hadn't always drawn. She learnt to draw at art school as a student, going through quite a conventional training, in her case through the required observational and life drawing classes at Pratt in the mid-50s, then going on to Yale and studying with Joseph Albers, which undid a lot of that. This is one of her colour exercises for Albers. And after all, for Albers, drawing, when he was drawing and when he was teaching drawing, was always about learning to see and not learning to see something. But Albers never stopped her love of the expressive gesture, these kind of gestures that would fill her drawings of the early 60s. So once she got hold of drawing, it became something that was ever present. She drew her way from that point through life, and it appears that she did so with, as I said, this remarkable facility, even when other work wasn't going so well, and even especially when it wasn't coming along as she wanted, or even coming along at all. Or maybe this means that drawing actually wasn't easy. It wasn't so much a facility in any straightforward way, but channeled difficulty in a rather different way. Well, that's what I'm going to try and suggest. So writing her monograph after her friend Eva had died in 1970, and the book was published 6 years later, Lucy Lippard was trying to make sense of a short but complex working life of around 10 years, that's all. And she couldn't pretend, Lippard couldn't pretend she liked all the work equally, and she clearly felt much less interest in the work before 1964, and you feel she found a way of describing how Hesse was actually able to overcome these kind of early drawings and paintings rather than develop a complex logic out of them. In this, she was certainly true to herself and to her time. much has changed in the meantime in the estimation of Eva Hesse's early work, and in particular of her drawings, and in particular her drawings like this from 1965. And of course there are several different accounts of her work that you could chart through this work on paper. You know, one would see the artist as simply learning to draw, another the evolution from figuration to abstraction. You know, there are early drawings of flowers and portraits through to drawings later on, afterwards of circles. You know, another narrative would track it from the artist turning from painter to sculptor. So these are all versions of the drawing narrative, and I guess all of them have some merits, but all of them use the drawings to draw conclusions about the work that Hesse made that isn't drawing. Whereas here, I want to ask a more basic question, more simple question of what drawing meant to her. You know, more simple in the sense that I'm trying to ask why artists draw in such a sustained or even compulsive way, some of them at least, and certainly Hesse is one of those who did. And rather than serve the purpose of an overview or synthesis, drawing might tell us something important about the artist's relationship with facility and difficulty as a day-to-day, you know, practical encounter with your work. With a sheet of paper or with your work. So the idea that drawing provided her with some other ground to work in that was necessary for an artist who turned so dramatically from painting to sculpture doesn't assume that there was anything simple about this. In fact, the assurance of some of her drawings with their multiple graphic idioms, almost as if she comes to find her own kind of graphic slang, is quite disarming, I think, in some ways. So Robert Ryman, who was a friend of Hesse's, and at the time Ryman was married to Lippard, described his approach to painting as, I don't paint anything, I do something with paint. And so, hence my title, I wanted to adapt that formulation to say that drawing in Hesse's hands meant a lot of different things, clearly, but they all come down in the end to doing something on paper. And of course, by extension, this meant not painting on canvas and not making sculpture. And it meant doing something on paper, usually at a desk or a table, using a pretty wide variety of tools, ranging through pencil, pen, gouache, watercolor, ink, and so on. It didn't necessarily mean drawing with an end in mind or drawing something, or making preparatory sketches, although it could be any of the above as well, but also just drawing. When drawing becomes a drawing would be an interesting discussion to have that I'll come back to in a bit. The traditional correlation between learning to draw and learning to look, one entrenched in Ruskinian beliefs about observing nature, was transformed by the pioneers of modernist abstraction, but never entirely abandoned. It's just that the object being observed has been turned inside out. And by the 1960s, there were plenty of different forms of drawing for ambitious young artists to look at, and none of them were particularly marginal or peripheral. The new, old, great artists like de Kooning and Gorky were given major drawing retrospectives. De Kooning's magisterial graphic work would be shown at the Museum of Modern Art in 1968, and Gorky, whom Hesse admired as much, if not more, had already been given an important show of his drawings by that time. At times you can see a remarkable proximity between the looking and the doing, the looking at drawing and the doing of drawing, especially early on when she seems so receptive to thinking graphically through the pencil mark. And there's a series of drawings from 1962 that are full of little knots of lines that defy oppositions between closed and open contour, and they have a strong relationship clearly to Gorky's intense kind of graphism, and you can almost see her responding to the mixtures of intricate little knots or small scribbles and the much more open and fluid delineation of the larger forms that you often find in a Gorky drawing. So different kinds of mark making create different rhythms, but also very distinctive and an almost vertiginous sense of scale. Perhaps more than any other artist, Gorky at that point offered for her a model of what an abstract drawing could be, and it showed her how close, I should keep this on, how close drawing could be to a doodle, but without actually being one. And as her work develops, I think she continues to tread and to want to tread that very fine line. So doing things on paper for Hesse also meant doing things with paper. And in the beginning, you can see her looking hard at what an abstract drawing could be made of, not only Gorky's, but maybe even more pointedly, de Kooning's consistent practice of adding extra bits of paper to his drawings. Rather than swift or spontaneous, the reality was a time-consuming process of adding and taking away, adding marks and bits of paper, only to take other bits of drawing away with an eraser or scratching them out. And these are tropes that Hesse used in her own way, for sure, but the colour and the decomposition were by now part of that larger collective graphic language. And although that language is often seen as subjective, that idea is so embedded still, so tenacious. Its currency poses the question, expressive of what or whom. And Hesse's drawings seem both very earnest, but also quite teasing or quite playful in this context. So Hesse understood from the start that drawing is not so much a tragic, but a kind of comic idiom, I think. And again, she's savvy about the way the great drawers used cartoon animation to drive that home. So de Kooning matter, Gorky being simply amongst the most obvious. And part of the look of facility in her drawings has to do with some of the more cartoony techniques that she liked to use. But in fact, the effect is an effect of mobile contours rather than actually easy to achieve. So the clarity dissembles, just as the doodles dissemble. It's as if line has become so elastic that it can actually switch, from one to the other. Now, the German filmmaker Werner Nikiz remembered that Hesse really liked the work of the Japanese animator Yogi Curry when she saw it at the little film club they held in Kettwig during the year that Hesse and her then husband Tom Doyle spent on a residency in Germany in 64-65. And Curry's film Ios was made in 1965. Forgive my image and the fact that it's not mobile. It's made in 64 using only black line on white ground. Curry, it's an amazing little film. It makes boxes open and close, alternatively spewing their innards and almost devouring the screen. So this jack-in-the-box motif had already actually been used by Hesse in some of her earlier drawings, but in response to Curry, I think it takes on a new vividness, a new kind of almost, any idea of a clean line is comically exaggerated in the explicitly sexual, kind of filthy content of Ios, which is a kind of, this pornographic deployment of the line. And Hesse uses it too to crank up these absurd erotics. It's not the best image of this. Forgive me for that. But, the absurd erotics of the machine drawings in the work of this incredible Japanese animator, in some ways it seems as important to Hesse as Duchamp and the model of the bachelor machine, to which we so often compare her drawings of this period. And the machine drawings look as if they came easily to her. And certainly it's easy to conclude that the reliefs that she went on to make would transform the line into three-dimensional work and into sculpture. But at the same time, I think that year that she spent in Germany, that year that was difficult for Hesse, both as an artist and as a person, was pretty difficult on every level, both personal and artistic. It's as if that her doing things on paper showed her the way out of a quandary that the work was in. And unable to make drawings, drawing seemed to give her the permission to move on. Her husband, the sculptor Tom Doyle, told Lippard that the drawing sustained her during that time. And while he was trying to get her to put them onto canvas, she translated them into relief. So a graphic line becomes materialized in the string that she would find everywhere around her in her temporary studio in Kettwig, which was actually in an old abandoned weaving building of the Scheidt textile factory. With hindsight, of course, this looks sort of like an inevitable development. In practice, lots of factors, a complex constellation of conditions are necessary for change like that, I think, to occur. No single cause is sufficient to explain how she switched to make reliefs out of string from this. And in practice, too, a drawing process is open rather than closed or inevitable. And my point, of course, is that the serial animation of drawings like this that are part of a larger series is part of the fiction of a flowing and a morphing of forms one into the other. When you look at a drawing like this and others in the series, they're absurdly non-functioning and issueless. And a counter-reading then would suggest that rather than mobilize the flow, they actively reflect on the quandary she found herself in, the getting nowhere, the being stuck. That is, I want to suggest that the drawings invite us to think about what stalls and blocks, as well as what is creative and generative, because in that contradiction, maybe Hesse found some way through. And in this context, I don't think it's accidental that psychoanalytic writers from Freud on have concerned themselves with drawing as at once symptomatic of a failure as well as an exemplary vehicle for creativity. So Marion Milner, in her famous book on not being able to Paint that she wrote in 1950 wrote of her own experience of artist's block as well as that of her patients. And she talked interchangeably, in fact, about drawing and painting, but in fact, she's mainly talking about drawing. But perhaps it's Donald Winnicott's use of drawing that's most interesting to take into account here, and brings us back to Lippard's supposition that for Hesse, drawing allowed her to express her deepest feelings. So Winnicott famously got his child patients to play the squiggle game, which allowed them to communicate their feelings visually. And many of us have played this game without knowing it. Without knowing it was Winnicott's therapeutic tool, or as he termed it, the game without rules. In one exchange with a disturbed child, the psychoanalyst added a circle to the patient's frantic scribble, making it resemble a plate of spaghetti, and therefore whole for Winnicott. And doodling was a big part of Winnicott's own visual imaginary, and Winnicott was also a drawer, as we can see in his frustrated sculpture, Wanted to Be an Ordinary Thing, a rather good commentary on the relationship between sculpture and things, as well as a joke and an insight into frustration. When Hesse's early drawings incorporate something like doodling, on the other hand, there's something, I think, very different going on. And this isn't only because Winnicott turned the squiggle into a recognizable image, and Hesse, of course, deliberately prevaricates to make the abstract and the figurative elements in her drawing consistently ambiguous. But at stake now is surely something more, something about what might turn a doodle into a drawing, and drawing into a drawing that's worth looking at. And this is true, I think, of all the drawings that she made as pictures, rather than the drawings that she made when she was figuring out her sculpture, of the kind that I've been showing, some of them after she returned to New York in 1965. Or rather, I've been showing you the drawings she made as pictures, excuse me. But it's also perhaps relevant, finally, to some of the drawings she made after she returned to New York in 1965. But even there, or even here rather, a scribble's transformed into another register as a potential idea. And one drawing, this is a drawing from one of her notebooks from 1968. It's a dense swirl of lines that lies at the base of sweeping vertical ones, suggesting this chaotic fall. And it's a drawing for a work that she never made. Although there's a trial piece that exists that shows her making it in part with long rubber tubes attached to a rectangular piece of canvas attached to the wall. She made a whole set of notes attached to the drawing, rubber, attach each and let fall, grey, long, thin rubber. As you can see, it's on fishback gallery paper, so it's quickly done as a sketch for a work after another work. Right, this is Aeneid. It's a sketch done after a work that she'd already made, as in this one from 1966 called Aeneid, but it's also an idea for another potential work that she never makes. So something that looks very like a scribbled has been turned into something else, or is in the process of being turned into something else. It's a material token of a translation between line, string of the earlier iteration, and rubber tube, the projected work that's never made. So it's a drawing of a hypothetical sculpture, you could say, or maybe we could say it's a frustrated drawing that wants to be a sculpture but never manages to be that sculpture. So perhaps a better word for difficulty is frustration. And according to Adam Phillips, frustration is where we start from. So in his reading of Freud, I quote, "Our possibilities for satisfaction depend upon our capacity for frustration. If we can't let ourselves feel our frustration, and surprisingly, this is a surprisingly difficult thing to do, we can't get a sense of what it is we might be wanting and missing and what might really give us pleasure." So, thought about this way, frustration is a driving force as well as a blocking one. So rather than saying that drawing expresses Hesse's deepest feelings, maybe we can say that it was a way of articulating her frustration. You know, that is the shortfall between the wanting and the having, the thwarting and the satisfaction that's vital to creative life. So in this sense, the need to draw is not so simply that, you know, the drive to carry on making work. So doing things on paper wasn't a substitute for doing supposedly more important things like making a sculpture or making a painting, but what Hesse did because she was an artist and not just a doodler. Thank you.